Our next operation is constructing the lining and the facing. It's all one unit, and so we're going to learn how to sew these little corners. We're going to be sewing center back seam on the neck. We're going to be sewing side seams on the facing to the lining, and we're going to bind the entire edge with a Hong Kong binding. So as you can tell, this is quite a lot of work, so let's get busy. The two initial things we want to do to the facing are, one, I want to mark the stitching line at this intersection, which I have done with the chalk wheel and the ruler. We will be stay stitching with a very short stitch, and then I also want to sew the center back seam and press this open. Now, this little angle here, this is what's called an inside corner. We're going to be using a particular technique to sew this to the lining. We're also going to be sewing the body front to the body back. But I have a prepared video on how to sew inside corners. So I'm going to start by running that. Enjoy. Knowing how to sew a really crisp inside corner is going to serve you well in any situation where you're sewing an oblique angle with an obtuse angle. This is a 90 degree, but the steps that we're using will work really on anything. Like, for example, if you're sewing the underarm gusset on a garment, or if you're sewing a collar to a shawl lapel jacket, you're going to run into what I call inside corners. Now, these both have different looks. You can see here, the surface is completely flat. So in this instance, we've pressed everything open so that it reads flat. On this one, just to compare, this one you can see, just by how the light plays off of it, that you have all of the seam allowances pressed in one direction, so it creates what looks like an inset. The only difference in these is in the pressing. The construction is pretty much the same. So we have plenty to do, so let's get busy. To begin, as you can see here, I have marked the stitching lines on both pieces. Now, it's an optical illusion, but this line equals this line, and this line equals this line. These are 1-inch seam allowances. I find that for this, it's easier to have a wider seam allowance and then trim it down if you need to later. The first step is going to be cutting about 1 inch square of a fusible Pellon. Then we will fuse that right at this intersection here to stabilize that corner. So I will go off camera and fuse that, bring it back here, and show you my results. So here we are. We have that reinforced. And so now I just want to trace out those lines here so I know where my corner is. Because this is going to be our stitching guide for the next step. Next, we go to the machine. Here we are at the machine, and we're going to be sewing about 3/8 of an inch from the corner down, and then we're going to turn and sew that way. So first I will put the needle in, and as you can see I'm using an orange thread so you can see what we're sewing. And let me just zoom in a little bit here so you can get a better look. So the key here, 0.5 to 0.75 stitch length, short stitch, and then we turn 1 stitch. Like so. going to back up a little bit here. Take the work out. I'm going to show you. You can see that one little stitch walking across is going to give us space to cut. It'll give us room for the scissors, and it's going to help us to turn this corner when we sew it to the other piece. I will trim the threads, and I will meet you back at the work table. Here we are. Now, this is where we clip this corner. Now the short stitches enable you to clip right up to the stitches, but you sneak up on it. You don't have to get there all in one go. This is where having a good scissors is going to help you. Notice I've cut right to that row of stitching. That's important for the next step. So now that we've cut this, we're going to start pinning it to the other piece here. I've turned the pieces this way because we're going to start here and sew down to this corner in the first step, and then eventually we're going to start here and sew the rest of the way. So I find it's a little easier to sort of get my bearings, because first thing we want to do is match this point with this point. And since everything is going to be matched up right sides together, the easiest way for me to see it is to turn this over like so. Then I'm going to put the pin in right there. And you want the pin to emerge on that corner, or dead on that corner. Okay, so we have those 2 points matched, and you can pin like so. So as you can see, we're pinned dead on that corner. Now we're going to match backwards and pin baste. Just make sure that your pins, you pin it so that both stitching lines are one on top of the other. Now you could, if you want to, after you've pinned it, you could thread baste this. That is entirely kosher. If I were thread basting, I would use the thread that's in the machine so that you don't have to worry about not getting all of your thread basting out. So what's going to happen when we take this over to the machine, we're going to start here and we're going to sew down to here. That's our first pass on sewing this corner. I'll meet you at the machine. I'm here at the machine, and I have changed thread color to blue so you can see the new stitching that we're sewing. And we're going to put the needle down right on the stitching line, and we'll start with the standard 2.5 stitch length until about 3/8 of an inch from the corner, and then we'll shorten the stitch. So to begin, you see I pin basted, and we're going to sew along the stitching line. There we go. Okay, so you can see here we have the short stitches that we sewed to stay stitch. Now I'm going to shorten the stitch to 0.5 to 0.75, and then we're going to sew until we get to the corner. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more. Okay, we're at the corner. Now, this is crucial, so pay attention here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to raise the presser foot. I'm going to turn it about 45 degrees. Then I'm going to open this up and lower the foot. And we're going to sew off the fabric onto the seam allowance of the underlayer. So now, let me just take this out of the machine. show you what it looks like. So you can see here, sewn down to the corner, off the edge, and I'll turn it over on this way so you can see also from the back. That is what that stitch looks like. So now making that turn is going to make it so that when we sew the other side, we're going to have a razor sharp corner. So we've sewn, I'm going to take this over to the work table, and we're going to continue. Our next step really is turning everything this way. And so it's all hinging on that little V-shaped stitching. And so we're going to pin this here on the marked line on the other side. And we will pin baste all of these to make sure that they sit exactly one on top of the other. So again, like I said, if you really wanted to hand baste it, no harm, no foul. So this is how it's going to go. We're going to start the stitching right here and sew that way. But we'll go to the machine for that. So our next step, the machine. We're back at the machine, and I have changed the thread so that the bright pink is going to be for the final step. Now, this particular foot is the generic adjustable zipper foot. What I love about this foot is that you can adjust it, pardon my manicure, you can adjust it so that the needle sits right at the edge of the foot or even slightly outside the foot. And having it even slightly outside the foot is going to serve in this particular case. Because when we come in here, what we're going to be doing here is we want the needle to go in right there, right at that corner. Let's see if I can get some light in there. I'm going to take that out. There we go. You can see it a little better. So the needle goes in right there. And the beauty of this is that the foot sits over here. You have all of the mass here. You don't have to worry about the foot disturbing any of this. That's what I love about this foot. Now we're going to start stitching at 0.5, 0.75. You start stitching at the short stitches, and we're going to sew away from this corner. Now you notice that the stitching that we're sewing is ever so slightly to the left of the stay stitching. That's as it should be. And then when we've gotten about 3/8 of an inch in, then we can just sew and voila. Now, I'll show you, do a close-up here. You can see the needle started. And if it starts a little bit off of the fabric, that's okay, as long as you catch that corner. So now let's do a little reveal. That, even before pressing, you have a good sharp corner. That's the mark of good sewing. Next, we're going to trim and press, so I will meet you at the pressing table. Now there are two different ways of pressing. But before we actually press the seam allowances to their final destination, we want to press everything as sewn. And so you can press the seam allowances all to one side, which I'm going to choose to do in this particular sample. So press it on a seam roll. And there you have it. So what this does is it puts all the bulk to this side, so you have a little bit of a roll. You have a little bit of a dimensional quality to it. Now, the other option is you can trim out this corner here and press everything open. It's a subtle difference, but this one presents a flatter surface. This one makes the fabric look a little bit inset. Now, after you have pressed this, you can come back and trim out this seam allowance to about half of its beginning width. That way, in the final garment, when you press it, you're not going to have this big bulk here. It's going to lie smoothly. So, inside corners. So while you were enjoying that instructional video, I have worked ahead a little bit. As you can see, I've sewn the center back seam, and I'm going to explain a little something about these little jogs that you see. I like to narrow the seam allowances, say like 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge down. These are about 1/4 of an inch here and here, because you're going to have this caught into a seam and you're going to have this caught into a seam. So narrowing the seam allowances down reduces the bulk, so you don't have the full width of each of these seam allowances caught into the seam. So this is kind of what I call preventive grading. Okay, so then now here, I'm going to zoom in on this, because if you remember from the video that you just watched, we can come in here and clip right to the stitching. So this is going to enable us to sew this to the lining. So let me just pull out so you can see kind of where everything is going to land. So when we sew this together, we will match it at the center fronts, or the center back. Just zoom in here a little bit. I like to match the corners first. So that will sew to here, then this will sew around to here, and then this will sew to here. And we're going to be using the method that you just learned in the video to sew the corners. So I'm going to pin everything in place and sew it, and I will bring it right back. So what I've done here is I have sewn the first pass and turned the corner. And next, if you remember, we made the little clips at the center back. There's one of the clips, match the center back with the seam, and then I've matched these raw edges. So the next pass, sewing this corner, is going to start right there, and it's going to sew, and I'm going to stop at the center back. I will do that on the machine, and I will bring it back so you can see it. Okay, so we are halfway there. I started, you can see the thread right there. I started right there, and I sewed to just a little bit before this center back seam, so that we have the lining sewn to the facing. Now I'm going to turn this right side out just so you can get a sense of where we're going here. So here, I will press that all open later. So our next step, I'm going to be matching these two center backs and pinning, lining up this corner with this corner. So I will go pin this off camera and bring it back and show you the step. So here we are. Let me just turn this over. So see, that is the pleat that is formed by matching the two center backs. And so I pinned, and we're going to sew all the way over to the corner and turn the angle as we did before. So I will go to the machine and sew this and bring you back the results. So here we are. We've sewn from here to here and then turned and stitched off. Now, see, there is your pleat. That's how it forms. So our final pass, I'm going to pin and sew out to there. So I will go off camera, pin it, show you what I have done, and then take it to the machine. There is our pinning, and I will bring it back from the machine all sewn. We're back from the sewing machine. So now all of the seam allowances will press to the lining. So what I want to do here is trim out the corners on the lining. Like so. Now, let's press it in 3 stages. First stage, the shoulders. Second, 3 stages. 1 stage, 1 shoulder. Then the other shoulder, and finally the neck seam. So here, press that one here. Press the second shoulder down. And now the neck needs a little bit of clipping. So let me just get this in position so you can see where I'm at, what I'm working on. So we need to clip the seam allowances so everything will open out around the curve. And this is where you would stagger your clips. So 1 clip, 1 clip, 1 clip, and so forth all the way across. Even though we're pressing them towards the lining, we want the raw edge of the collar to spread nicely. That's why we're clipping everything. So all of these are clipped. And so then we want to shape it, because this is a curve around the neck. And we press. So now let's turn this right side out, show you the results. So I'm going to zoom in so you can appreciate it a little bit. And what's beautiful is that angle. So the next step will be back at the work table. So here we have the lining and facing unit. Now let me show you what I sewed off camera. The shoulder and the neck are what we showed in the last clip. But before I brought it over to the table here, I sewed the side seam lining to the facing and pressed all the seam allowances towards the lining. So really now what this wants is a Hong Kong binding all the way around. So I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to pin and sew that binding and bring you back the finished unit. And here we have the facing finished with the Hong Kong binding. Now the Hong Kong binding goes on exactly the same way as it did on the side seams, except you don't have to stretch anything, you just have to bind the edge. Now I'm going to show you a little sort of a grace note here. What I like to do, because this part of the facing is going to be tacked down, but that edge there on the lining, to my eye, looks a little unfinished. So this is let me see if I can get this, figure out how to do this here. So I'm going to be using the pinked edge rotary cutter blade. And actually it's going to be a little easier if I do it this way. So what I'm going to do is fold this back, because you don't want to cut through the lining itself. You just want to pink this edge here. And if you have pinking shears that you can reliably cut with, it would be a little easier, but so this is how I prefer for the final finish to be on this seam allowance going from the side seam to the other side seam. So I will go off camera and finish that and bring you back the results. And it's complete. So let us survey what we just created. I have this folded in half so we can see pretty much what we've done here. We have the Hong Kong binding around the edge of the facing and lining unit. We also sewed the side seams, and we sewed the shoulder and neck seams on the facing to the lining. So this is ready to put away, and we're off to the next technique.